Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to this Adventures in Ideas seminar, which is part of our first ever series of events, webinar events for Carolina Public Humanities. Today, we're launching a seminar on polarization and presidential elections in that divided America. And I'm Lloyd Kramer, professor of history and also director of Carolina Public Humanities, and I'm also going to be the speaker in this first session of this week's seminar. We'll continue the seminar tomorrow at 5:30 with Freddie Kiker, who is an historian who graduated from UNC and is an expert on the history of the American Civil War, and on Wednesday with Professor Suzanne Clobetti, who teaches in the political science department at UNC Chapel Hill and is an expert on modern American politics. And then we'll conclude the seminar on Thursday with a panel discussion with our speakers, as we always do at CPH weekend seminars. We're all learning more about technology as we advance in this new world of virtual humanities, and we hope that each of you will maintain a good internet connection during this seminar. But I should mention that we're also recording these events, so for any reason you lose your connection or you're unable to see the whole program, you'll be able to see it later. We'll be posting recorded versions of each session. We have more than 100 registered participants in this Zoom webinar. So I'm thinking that we're all part of a humanities community, and we're going to be in a shared discussion, even though we're not in the same space. I'm in Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill with my colleagues Max Orr, who will be conveying questions at today's seminar, and with Paul Bonici, who does a fantastic job in managing all of the technological bells and whistles of these CPH webinars and Zoom events. You won't be able to turn on your own cameras or audio functions, but you can send questions and comments to us throughout the seminar today by using the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen. And this will be the pattern throughout the seminar this week. So as I've noted, this seminar will focus on highly polarized American elections. And we'll be discussing the polarized presidential elections of 1800, 1860, and 1968. In each of these years, many Americans believed the republic was in danger of falling apart. And that was in fact what happened in 1860. But somehow the republic ultimately survived, and here we are in 2020. And many people are worried today that our extremely polarized political culture is again creating dangers to the survival of American democracy. Can the political system that the founders set up in 1788 still work in the 21st century? This is a question that people are asking as we deal with the uncertainties of voting and the complexities of the electoral college system. And at Carolina Public Humanities, we believe that historical perspectives will help us gain insights into the kind of crisis we seem to be facing today. What is similar to the past and what is new as we think about 2020? So it's been my pleasure to be a member of the team that organized this event, and I'm going to be the moderator of the seminar throughout the week. I especially want to thank Paul Bonici and Max Orr for the great work they've done in developing the technology for this event, including the camera and the audio and all of the visuals that you'll be seeing in the course of this week's seminar. And I also want to thank Flyleaf Books here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for partnering with us on humanities events and for allowing us to set up a humanities seminar here in this beautiful bookstore, a kind of studio for the humanities. So I know you're joining from many different places around North Carolina and even beyond North Carolina, but I like to think that we're all coming into the space of a bookstore in Chapel Hill. We're in the midst of a great upheaval at the present time, and although the COVID pandemic is not the same kind of crisis as Americans experienced in 1800 or 1860 or 1968, it's creating uncertainties that definitely complicate American political life. We don't know how our current conflicts will evolve, But we have to remember that this is exactly the situation that people faced in 1800 and 1860 and 1968. When you're in the midst of a great crisis, you don't know the outcomes that future people will look back on and write history books about and explain, well, we can see how this was going to come out. So we don't know what it was like to live through the events of, say, 1800. But we know that those events led to a legacy that in some ways we're still dealing with today. A legacy of polarization, but also a legacy that found a way to move beyond the conflict that nearly tore the country apart. So we're going to try to gain analytical perspectives on uncertain times as a way to get a new perspective on our own time. I want to thank the Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley for their ongoing support of our programs. And I also appreciate the generous support of Carolina Meadows, the continuing care retirement community in the Chapel Hill area. The support of these sponsors and many other contributing friends enables us to prevent these kinds of events. And I want to thank all of our generous donors and many of you who are with us today for your support, your financial support, and your encouragement as we've gone through this pandemic and as we continue to go through this pandemic. And your continuing support for Carolina Public Humanities is important for all of us. And there's information about how to contribute to CPH on our website and also on the screen now. We also want to thank UNC's General Alumni Association for their ongoing collaboration and their support for our programs. We collaborate with the GAA on many programs here at Flyleaf Books, and we are going to continue those collaborations in the coming months and years. So although these events are now taking place as Zoom webinars, you can continue to register on the CPH website or by calling our CPH office as you always have, and there will be people there to assist you. We are also having a series of programs here at Humanities called Humanities in Action here at Flyleaf Books. Our next program will be on October 16th, and it will feature Dr. Lenice Williams, an associate professor of art history. And Dr. Williams will be speaking on the challenges we face in keeping the historical record of Black communities and Black newspapers in an age that is increasingly oriented toward digital research, because many of these Black newspapers have never been digitized. Her talk is called Erasures, Black History, Black Newspapers, and Digitization. And I hope you'll join us for this event on October the 16th at 3:30 p.m. And I want to mention an ongoing biography series led by Max Orr, which is featuring authors and experts on different biographical figures. Some are well known, some not so well known. And this is taking place on Fridays, and it's called Lunch with Friends and Strangers. And these events feature a kind of informal conversation about important historical figures. And the next event will be on this coming Friday at 12 p.m. And it will feature Kathy Williams, a member of UNC's Department of Dramatic Arts and a talented performer at the Playmakers Repertory Company. And she's going to be talking about Ida B. Wells, because she performed a role in which she portrayed Ida B. Wells theatrically. And Max is going to be talking to her about why Ida B. Wells, a great advocate for civil rights, an African-American woman who wrote about lynching and who contributed important journalistic innovations in the early 20th century, why Ida B. Wells is important to us today. So that will take place this coming Friday. Finally, I want to note that our collaboration with Flyleaf Books includes the opportunity for you to purchase books on the themes that we'll be discussing in this week's seminar. And we've portrayed a few of those titles in the loop at the beginning of this program, but I encourage you to come buy Flyleaf Books starting this coming week. They are open again for browsing, but you can also order books online. And as I say, we very much appreciate our collaboration with Flyleaf Books. Most of you have attended previous programs and seminars of Carolina Public Humanities, so you know that we've been organizing faculty seminars and programs since 1979. Last year we celebrated our 40th anniversary, and now we're in our 41st year, which is different from any year we've ever had before. But our goals and mission remain the same, even as we move online. And our goal is to link the expertise and the scholars of the University of North Carolina with the people of North Carolina and with people far beyond North Carolina, because we want to foster dialogues about the humanities between people inside and outside the university. And in addition to our programs at Flyleaf Books and our Adventures and Ideas programs, we sponsor a number of programs for K-12 teachers. We call this our Partnership for Public Education and the Humanities. We also co-sponsor events at community colleges. So when you are involved with Carolina Public Humanities, you are part of a community that extends to public education and community colleges, as well as our own conversations at Carolina Public Humanities. I want to thank teachers who may be attending today. I think we have 7 or 8 in the audience, and you are very welcome at all of our CPH events. We like to honor teachers. I should note that people who teach in the schools can receive certification credits from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And you can send an email to Paul Bonici at CPH to request information about receiving this credit. I also want to thank Susan Landstrom, Vicki Breeden, and Paul Bonici, Brian Insminger, as well as Max Orr for all of the good work they've done to prepare for this seminar and for all of our online events. As I've noted, Paul is in the room today managing the computer, and Max is here, and he's going to be fielding questions when we get to the Q&A part of today's program. And finally, I want to recognize and thank the members of our extraordinary advisory board who have continued to provide essential support and encouragement and advice throughout the current upheavals. I think that about 10 of our board members are attending this webinar, and I just want to give you a pat on the back, figuratively speaking. Among those in the audience, I particularly want to shout out to Abby Allen and Dick Amistadi, Paul Connick, Jerry Everhart, Sarah Gear, Claudia Cadis, John McQuaid, Jackie Posner, Joe Rytok, and Miriam Zietlow. All of you are essential to our program, and we all appreciate the work you do and the service you provide for the humanities. Now I want to just very briefly summarize the plan for this seminar. I've noted that we'll have 3 talks over 3 days, and each session will last about 75 minutes. There'll be time for questions at the end of each talk and also at a concluding panel discussion on Thursday afternoon. We'll collect questions throughout the seminar and also after the presentations through the Q&A function on your computer. You simply click on the icon for Q&A, and you'll see a box in which you can write your question or comment. And either Max or I will then convey the questions to our speakers. And we'll use this same format for the panel discussion on Thursday at 5:30 p.m. So each of these programs will focus on a different political era, but our overall theme will stress the recurring problem of extreme political polarization. These polarizing conflicts often evolve along sectional lines, north versus south, east versus west, but they also extend far beyond sectional divisions. And America's political polarizations are linked to cultural conflicts, to religious differences, to racial and racist ideologies, and to economic activities. And we're going to be talking about all of these polarizing components of American political culture. And in these periods of extreme polarization, people in the same family or community can become so angry that they hardly speak with each other. These are the moments of great polarization. But history moves on. Polarizations give way to something else. And our question is, how do people respond to polarizing conflicts? And how do these conflicts reshape public and political life? And this is the question we are going to explore amid the polarizations of 2020 by looking at the great polarizations of 1800, 1860, and 1968. So I'm pleased to be the first speaker in this seminar. I should note very briefly, by way of introduction, that I've been in the UNC History Department since 1986, and that my own field of research and writing focuses mainly on the history of France and the Atlantic world during the era between roughly 1770 and 1850. But I'm also interested more broadly in the history of nationalism and the history of transnational exchanges and cross-cultural experiences. And so my work on the history of nationalism has brought me into US history in this period, as well as another work I focused on, the life of Lafayette, who mediated between nationalism in the United States and in France. So this is the framework for our opening session, which is entitled The Early American Republic and the Political War of 1800. And I want to discuss 1800 as a starting point for the next two seminar sessions on 1860 and 1968. So now I'm going to take off my moderator hat and put on my humble hat as a historian of 1800. So the election of 1800. I put here on the screen images of the candidates in that famous election, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. This election, 1800, became one of the most polarizing events in American history. And many people at the time thought that the Republic might not survive the extreme partisan bitterness and suspicion of that struggle. This was just 12 years after the Constitution had established the United States of America. And this election was truly a year of extreme polarization. This is an image of the Capitol that you're seeing here, the Capitol building, because in the summer of 1800, the government moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. In 1800, the election was between the Federalist Party. This was the first really significant election of mobilized political parties, the Federalist Party and what was known as the Republican Party, or the Democratic Republican Party for the full name, but it was usually just called the Republican Party. But this, of course, was not the Republican Party we know by that name. That Republican Party was founded in the 1850s. This Democratic Republican Party was called Republican because of its strong anti-monarchical views, its advocacy of republicanism. And in 1800, the election came to a tie in the Electoral College, so that it was settled in what's called a contingent election in Congress in February of 1800, the first election to be settled in the US Congress. So let me just say a little bit about what happened in 1800. This is going to be like one of those movies where you have a very dramatic scene and then a flashback that tells the whole story of how we got to that scene. So here's the scene before the flashback, or the scene before the polarization. So in this election, there were 138 voters in the Electoral College, but each voter could cast 2 ballots. And so there were 276 total votes. All of the Republican electors voted for their candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So they ended up tied at 73 votes each. That's the irony. The 2 finalists were in the same party because they had not yet created the 12th Amendment, which created a provision for the vice president to run as the running mate of the president. John Adams, the Federalist candidate, came in third with 65 electoral votes, and his vice presidential candidate, who was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, received 64 votes. You see, this was what the plan was supposed to be. One elector of each party would not vote for both candidates so that one would win by 1 vote. But the Republicans held the line, and they've all voted for exactly the same 2 candidates, Jefferson and Burr. If one of Burr's voters had not voted for him, Jefferson would have won the election. This map shows how it broke down. The graph on one side shows the votes, 73 and 73 for Jefferson and Burr, 65 for Adams. You can see that it was divided somewhat geographically in that all of New England went for Adams. New York went for Jefferson. Pennsylvania was split. Maryland was split, and North Carolina was split, but the other states all went for Jefferson. So because of this tie, 73 to 73, the election went to the House of Representatives. And let me show you what that looked like. There were 16 states. That meant in order to win the election, each state had one vote. Didn't matter how many electoral votes they had. In the Congress, each state has one vote. And this is still the case today. If by some fluke, the election in 2020 should end up exactly tied, it would go to Congress, and each state would get one vote. So Wyoming would have as much impact as California in the House of Representatives. So in this case, Kentucky, for example, had as much impact in the House of Representatives as New York or Massachusetts, even though its population was much smaller. So when the vote came, 8 states voted for Jefferson, 6 states voted for Burr because they're congressional delegates. The 6 states that were controlled by Federalists all voted for Burr because they so hated Jefferson, even though Burr was also on the on the Republican ticket. And this vote continued over 35 ballots, exactly the same, every ballot. 8 states for Jefferson, 6 states for Burr, 2 states tied. Let me just give you an idea of what this means. South Carolina, if you look on this map, South Carolina has 8 electoral votes, and it went for Jefferson in the Electoral College. However, the congressional delegation was controlled by the Federalists, so when the vote got to the House of Representatives, the Federalist congressional representatives from South Carolina did not vote for Jefferson, even though their electors had all voted for Jefferson. You see how complicated this could be. Well, the bitterness on all sides was incredibly intense. There was incredible suspicion of manipulation. There was incredible anger. But finally, on the 36th ballot, a few of the Federalists decided to give up. And they gave up in part because Alexander Hamilton, one of the key leaders of the Federalist Party, so hated Aaron Burr that he encouraged some of the Federalist representatives to vote for Jefferson. They would never vote for Jefferson, but they stopped voting for Burr. So in the 36th ballot, the Federalists in Maryland and Vermont simply didn't vote, so their states now swung into Jefferson's column. And in Delaware and South Carolina, 2 more Federalist states, they simply didn't vote in the 36th ballot. So now there were only 14 states, and it went 10-4 for Jefferson. And so one of the most notable presidents in American history, Thomas Jefferson, won a vote in the House of Representatives by 10-4 after 36 ballots. This was one of those transitional elections because the Federalists never again won a presidential election. This was the end of the Federalist Party, even though they had controlled Congress and the presidency essentially since the beginning of the Republic. So this is a fascinating story, an election that was unbelievably tense. It went for more than a week in the House of Representatives. Nobody knew what was going to happen. This was long before we had CNN and Fox News, but you can imagine people hanging around the Capitol trying to make sense of what was going on. So in this talk, I'm not going to try to explain all of the debates that took place in the House of Representatives. I'm not going to explain what finally led to this outcome. What I want to focus on is the extreme polarization that led to this impasse. How did we get to this point? That's the question. That's the historical question. And I want to argue that the hostility between the Federalists and the Republicans in 1800 grew out of the increasing polarization of the previous decade. It didn't just happen in 1800, it was the culmination. Just as our polarization today is a kind of culmination of the last few decades, so the situation in 1800 was a culmination of polarization. And it is amazing to see how many of the issues that polarized people in 1800 are exactly similar to the issues that are polarizing people in 2020. It's a very humbling experience to plunge into the documents of 1800. So let me begin by noting that this polarization in 1800 was already apparent as early as 1796. You can see here a state-by-state result of the previous election, the first contested election, because of course in 1788 and 1792 George Washington just went in unanimously. But this was the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And you'll notice that it's a kind of sectional divide. North Carolina's electoral votes are split, but virtually every other state north of Pennsylvania went for Adams, and every state south of Pennsylvania or Maryland went for Jefferson. So this is one of the polarizations that was already in place by 1796 and certainly by 1800. It's also a polarization that still exists in some ways today, north and south. But this polarization will reappear again and again in American history. It, of course, reappears in 1860. In some ways, it reappeared in 2012 and 2016, but I'm not going to focus on this particular polarization. Instead, I want to discuss a series of polarizing ideologies and conflicts. And I put a lot of writing up here. I apologize, but it just seemed easier if I could summarize this, and then I'm going to go through and discuss each of these. So the question, you might say this is the organizing question of this talk. Why and how did American culture become so polarized in 1800? And there were many reasons for this. I sent out in advance a reading from an article that I wrote a few years ago about the impact of the French Revolution on American politics and the creation of American political parties. And the first of these polarizing forces of the 1790s were very different views on Europe and the French Revolution. The Federalists, who were very hostile to the French Revolution, the Republicans, who were much more sympathetic. Secondly, each party felt that the other party was a deep threat to the very survival of the republic. And this is something we see today, the fear that if the other side wins, the whole system is going to be crushed. The other side is so dangerous that it will impose by authoritarian methods an anti-democratic regime. And so there were different views on the danger of authoritarianism, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to all these, of course. The third key element of this polarization was different views on religion and the role of churches in the United States. This may sound a little familiar as well, the question of how important should religion be in secular political life. And then a fourth element, conspiracy theories. You cannot believe how many conspiracy theories there were in 1800. We have conspiracy theories on the internet all the time now. The conspiracy theories ran rampant in 1800. And I want to talk about how each side believed there were conspiracies being waged by the other side to destroy the republic. And then there was a big debate about immigration, another issue that may sound familiar. There were very different views on immigration and the rights to citizenship and who should be allowed to vote. And this became another flashpoint in 1800, just as it is in 2020. But then this debate about immigration spilled over into yet another debate, which was a view of the press and newspapers. Very different views of the role of the press and how it should be managed, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the sedition laws, but an attempt to control the press became one of the key themes of the Federalist campaign. And then an issue that will resonate with all of us in 2020, the issue of race. Because in 1800, there was a profound concern about slavery and the racial hierarchies that were emerging in the South, and the position of African Americans, and the emergence of abolitionism. And in 1800, there was an attempted rebellion among enslaved black people in Virginia, a kind of uprising, and a debate about, we might even say, Black Lives Matter, or a sort of consensus that Black lives won't matter. But the issue of race was also a crucial issue in 1800, as it is today. And then there was an ongoing debate about how the Electoral College would work. And each side jockeyed for position. And the Federalists, when they saw they were at risk, they made every effort they could to try to change the Electoral College system to gain an advantage. And I'll talk about the manipulation of the Electoral College and a great deal of anger about how the Electoral College worked. And then finally, I want to conclude with some comments about the judges and judiciaries and how the Federalists brought in a new Supreme Court justice at the very last minute in January of 1801 and completely transformed the judiciary in events that would even make today's debate about the Supreme Court seem almost modest. So I'm going to come back to that issue as well. So these are the issues of 1800, and I'm not going to discuss immediate parallels to 2020. I hope we can come back to this in the discussion and also in the panel later this week. But you can see that the polarization of 1800 had so much overlap with issues that recur in every great polarizing cultural and political conflict in America. So what I want to stress is that in 1800, each side believed the republic was at risk. That if the other side won, the values that had been established in the Constitution would be destroyed. And this grew out of the very unexpected development of political parties. I don't have an image of the Constitutional Convention, but here is the famous John Trumbull painting showing the authors of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, there are John Adams and Thomas Jefferson together. Isn't that ironic? The two great rivals in 1800 were standing together in 1776. No one, least of all George Washington and his colleagues, had expected the country to become so polarized within 12 years after the Constitution was created. They expected people to sit around quietly in a room discussing their votes and choosing electors who would represent the best person rather than interests or sectional concerns. But of course, this vision for the new republic fell apart very quickly. And during the 1790s, partly because of debates about a national bank and economic policies, and also because of debates about the French Revolution, very polarized political parties developed. So let me now go through in a kind of bird's eye view of the great polarizing issues, the 9 issues that nearly destroyed the Republic in 1800. And I want to begin with the French Revolution. Here we see the Bastille, of course, the famous attack on the Bastille in July of 1789. The intense polarization of the 1790s began in the period between 1791 and 1793, because it was in this period that government leaders such as John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington all became critics of the upheaval in France. At first, everybody sort of thought, oh, good, France is going to be like the United States. Look, Lafayette's out there leading the National Guard. But by 1792, Lafayette had fled for his life, the monarchy was collapsing, a more radical republic was emerging, and the Federalists, which was the term beginning to emerge and for references to John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they saw this revolution not as an advance of freedom, but as an assault on freedom, as an assault on social order, and not as an extension of the American Revolution. On the other hand, there was another group that coalesced around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe, who saw the French Revolution as a valid assault on a privileged social order and also as an advance of freedom, an expression of freedom. And they called the revolution an expression of freedom, and they organized groups called the Democratic Republican Societies that were advocating for the French Revolution. And the Federalists like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton saw these as subversive groups. Because Jefferson supported the revolution, and you might remember that Jefferson was in fact in Paris in 1789 and worked with Lafayette and others in developing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, because Jefferson was known to be a sympathizer of the revolution, he was condemned as a Jacobin. The Jacobins were the most radical revolutionary Republicans of the French Revolution. And here you see a cartoon portraying Jefferson worshiping at the altar of Gallic despotism. And this cartoon says he's about to throw the Constitution of the United States into the fire because he worships radicalism. But fortunately, the American eagle has swooped in and grabbed the Constitution from the man who wants to destroy it. Because Jefferson is so evil that he wants to destroy the American experiment and impose Jacobinism through these democratic Republican societies. So Jefferson was evil. This is a quote from one of the Federalist writers. Joseph Denny was a Federalist newspaper writer, and he criticized Jefferson. I should note that in the period between 1796 and 1800, Jefferson was the vice president because he came in second in the election of 1796, and at that time, the runner-up became the vice president. This was a problem that was solved by the 12th Amendment. But here's a typical Federalist critique of Jefferson. His principles relish so strongly of Paris and are seasoned with such a profusion of French garlic that he offends the whole Senate House. This awful man stinks up the Senate with the smell of the French Revolution. Smells like garlic. And this kind of language appears over and over, that Jefferson is going to destroy the Republic if he should ever get in there. This is a quote from another Federalist publication. There were many newspapers in Philadelphia and other places that waged a vehement attack on Jefferson. One was called Porcupine's Gazette, which you can see here. Another one was the Gazette of the United States, which was published in Philadelphia. And in October 1800, as the election was coming close in Pennsylvania, they published this comment. In a few days, the question will be seriously and strenuously made whether the experiment of a federal republic under religious, moral, and steadfast politicians, tracing the high road to order, dignity, glory, and independence is still to be essayed, or whether we be willing to submit to the Gallic domination of an acknowledged deist. This is the stake. The whole system is about to be destroyed by these evil Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. On the other side, there was an idea that Adams and the Federalists wanted to impose a monarchy, just like the monarchists in France, and that the Federalists were plotting to go to war with France. This all grew out of what was known as the XYZ affair. I'm not going to go into details about this, but there was a growing conflict with France and the United States because of a treaty the Americans signed with England in around 1796, the Jay Treaty. And the French started intercepting American ships. The Federalists wanted to fight the French. There was a kind of quasi-war. This is how it's always described. But the Republicans in the United States believed that Adams and Hamilton were using this as an excuse to create a military dictatorship in the United States. This is an English cartoon here, you can see, but it was loved by Federalists because it suggests that the French are stealing from the Americans. See, this is an image of an American being plundered by the French. And this is the kind of view the Federalists had, and they used it to justify the idea that we need to prepare for war. They built up an army. They built up the Navy. And I want to suggest that the anxiety, the terms of 1800, Jacobinism versus monarchism, are like the terms we hear today, where the Republican Party might, or the extreme wing of the Republican Party might describe the Democrats as socialism, and the more extreme wings of the Democratic Party might describe the Republicans as fascism. So we say, is it socialism or fascism? In those days, Jacobinism or monarchism. That's how people framed it. This is an editorial in a pro-Jefferson newspaper, the Aurora, which was also published in Philadelphia. This is on the eve of the election. It was actually begun by Benjamin Franklin Bash, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. The friends of peace will vote for Jefferson. The friends of war will vote for Adams or for Pinckney. And here, the assumption was that there was a kind of authoritarian threat, a federalist attempt to build up a navy. The navy was formally established in 1794. They put all these people in new uniforms, and then they created an additional army. George Washington was named the honorary commander, but Alexander Hamilton was the inspector general of the army, and he was the de facto commander. And then, of course, when Washington died in 1799, December of 1799, this was a traumatic event because the great leader had died, and now the assumption was people like Alexander Hamilton were going to try to take over in some kind of military repression. That was the concern. Alexander Hamilton as portrayed here by John Trumbull. On the other side, there was a fear of Jacobin repression. I already showed that cartoon of Jefferson. There was a fear that the Republicans were going to emulate the Jacobins. They were going to attack social elites. They were going to put people to death. This is an image of Queen Marie Antoinette and the guillotine in Paris. This kind of event was often evoked by the Federalists. They said, look, if the Jacobins get in, we won't be safe. And then after Napoleon's coup d'etat at the end of 1799, when news of this arrived in the United States in early 1800, both sides suspected that the other side had a kind of Napoleonic or Bonapartist desire to seize authoritarian control. So there was a fear of Jacobin repression and a fear of monarchical repression and a fear on both sides that there was going to be a kind of Napoleonic takeover. So that was the fear of authoritarianism that grew out of contrasting views of the French Revolution. This fear of authoritarian tendencies among the supporters of the other side became linked to a third fear, which grew out of religious ideas and anxieties, the views of religion. The Federalists were generally linked to the churches of New England and some of the Middle Atlantic states, where there had long been established congregational churches, going back to the colonial period and led by famous pastors such as Jonathan Edwards. But there were many important congregational pastors who played a role in the political life of New England. One of Jonathan Edwards' descendants, that is to say, I think Jonathan Edwards was in fact the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. That's right. Timothy Dwight was a grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the president of Yale University. He became one of those people who believed that the French Revolution and the Jeffersonians were going to destroy religion in America. And here is Timothy Dwight on your screen. And there was a widespread fear among religious people that religion was at risk, that religious freedom and religious institutions were going to be destroyed by the Republicans who were advocates of secularism and the French Enlightenment. On the other hand, the Republicans, the pro-French faction, believed that there must be a separation of church and state, that religion should not be guiding what happened in the United States. And this, in turn, created this anger among the Federalists. This is another quote from the Gazette of the United States. At the present solemn and momentous epoch, the only question to be asked by every American, laying his hand on his heart, is, shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God? Voting for Jefferson was like a vote against God. And this language, which has remained part of American political culture down to today. So by supporting one party or the other, you're actually supporting God or going against God. And this is the way the Federalists viewed Jefferson. On the other hand, as I said, the Republicans had a deep fear of church-state alliances, that religion was going to shape political life, there shouldn't be an established church, that the clergy should not have political power. And this was one of the themes of Thomas Jefferson that he put forward in the famous Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which had been passed in 1786, actually while Jefferson was in France. And this statute opposed any established church. And it was strongly supported by more secular thinkers or philosophes in America, but it was also supported by Baptists and Methodists who opposed the established Anglican or Episcopal Church or the established congregational churches. And so the Republicans also had a fear of how religion might affect politics. They just took the exact opposite view of the Federalists. Jefferson said, this is from one of his letters of 1800 when somebody wrote to him and said, "What's your view of religion?" He said, "I am for freedom of religion and against all maneuvers to bring about a legal ascendancy of one sect over another. For freedom of the press and against any violations of the constitutions, to silence by force and not by reason the complaints or criticism, just or unjust, of our citizens against the conduct of their agents." He said we must avoid any official religion, and we must avoid any attempt to oppose one religious position on the country as a whole. So this view of religion led to yet another fear, and this we'll describe as the fourth polarizing fear, the view of conspiracies. My gosh, we're living in a moment where conspiracies are on the internet all the time, each side suspecting the other. Well, this polarization over religion extended to a view of conspiracies that were attempting to take over the United States. And among the Federalists, there was a view that there was a secret conspiracy of the Bavarian Illuminati, which is an atheistic group, some secret society in Europe that had spread its agents into America and was trying to promote atheism in America. And here's Timothy Dwight again. He read this very influential book by John Robison, who was a Scottish writer. And Robison, had written this book, Proofs for a Conspiracy, against all religions and governments of Europe by the secret meetings of the Freemasons and Illuminati. And Dwight said, we must watch for this secret conspiracy. There's a kind of deep plot to overthrow religion and American Republican society. And here's how he described the Illuminati conspiracy in his 4th of July address. This is the president of Yale College warning the students. About the year 1728, Voltaire, great philosopher, Voltaire formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. Americans are bound by the voice of reason, of safety, and of God to shun all such connection with them, the Illuminati agents, as will interweave your sentiments or your friendship, will interweave your sentiments or your friendship, your religion or your policy with theirs. This was the warning of the great conspiracy, that Timothy Dwight assumed a secret conspiracy was going to take over the entire society. On the other hand, the Jeffersonians had a fear. And here we see an image of Alexander Hamilton. And I hope this image is coming through clearly. So Hamilton was suspected of organizing a plot to repress the Republicans. Remember, he's the commander of the army. And the Republicans believed that the Hamiltonians, supporters of Hamilton and Adams, were conspiring to go to war with France so as to justify a war with France. And this war would create a reason, to repress the Republicans. And so there was an equal fear of conspiracy among the Republicans. Okay, so there's conspiracy fears on both sides. I hope the images are coming through clearly. Is there a problem with the image? Not so clear, maybe. Okay, well, I apologize if you're having trouble seeing some of these images. I want to move on now to another polarizing factor in the period leading up to 1800. And this has to do with the issue of immigration. During the period of 1798, the Federalists feared that immigrants were leaning more and more toward the Jeffersonians, and that they were plotting to overthrow the Republic. That is, they were part of a conspiracy that might endanger, a Jacobin conspiracy, that might endanger the Republic. And so in 1798, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. And this, on your screen, you can see an image of New York, where many of the immigrants lived. And this was the key theme of the Alien Act. The president, in effect, could deport anyone who he suspected of being an unloyal immigrant. The law said it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to order all such aliens as he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, or shall have reasonable grounds to suspect or concerned in any treasonable or secret machinations against the government thereof, to depart out of the territory of the United States. In other words, the Federalists passed a law to deport aliens who they thought might be disloyal to the government. And this created enormous anger among immigrant communities in New York and in other cities outside of New York. This is a famous painting by William James Bennett, which shows where the workers were living along the docks in New York City. And one of the provisions of this new law was a restriction on voting. That in order to be a citizen, you now had to live in the United States for 14 years instead of 5, in order to get citizenship rights which enabled you to vote. And this created an urban critique of the Federalists, because there was an anger that many Federalists were plotting against immigrants. And there was a growing critique among the Republicans of the restrictions on voting. And the Federalists wanted to restrict voting because they thought immigrants would vote for the Jacobin Republicans. So there was tremendous debate about immigration in 1799, 1800, just as we're seeing in the year 2020. This is an image of Philadelphia, which did not have as many immigrants as New York City, but it was another place where immigrants were increasingly coming from Europe. And then, because the newspapers were increasingly supporting Republican candidates, the Federalists also passed the Sedition Law, which made it illegal to publish critiques of the president and of the Federalist leaders of Congress. The Federalists claimed that the Republicans were publishing fake news, false news, news that was not true. This is sort of something that really resonates with us today. You can imagine there are certain leaders who would love to pass a sedition law to make it illegal to publish certain newspapers. But the sedition law said, this is 1798, if any person shall write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States, or either house of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States, with intent to defame the said government, or to stir up sedition within the United States, then such person being thereof convicted before any court of the United States shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $2,000 and by imprisonment not exceeding 2 years. In other words, you could throw somebody into prison for up to 2 years. And one of the editors whom this happened to was this man, James Callender, who had published a newspaper, but also this pamphlet called The Prospect Before Us, in which he said John Adams was a threat to the Republic. He was accused of sedition, arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to something like 9 months in prison in Richmond. And under the provisions of the Sedition Act, there were 17 prosecutions against newspaper editors and publishers, 11 convictions, and a number of Republican editors spent time in prison and also had to pay fines. And both of these actions, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act, confirmed the Republican fear of authoritarianism among the Federalist Party. And this in turn created a great expansion of anti-Federalist newspapers, including the Aurora, which published repeated critiques of the Federalist, and the Federalist denounced for that false news that's described in the Sedition Act. So this issue of both immigrants and fake news led to yet another polarizing issue, the issue of slavery. Here we see an image of two people from New York. Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, and Aaron Burr, the Republican, Democratic Republican. During 1800, the issue of slavery and the problem of racism in America also surfaced in the election campaign. By 1800, there was a growing abolitionist movement in the Northeast, advocating for the abolition of slavery. Adams himself clearly opposed slavery. And Massachusetts, his home state, had abolished slavery in the early 1780s. There were no longer any legal enslaved people in Massachusetts. Aaron Burr, who became the Republican candidate in 1800, had also introduced legislation in New York to gradually emancipate enslaved people in New York. And that was eventually passed. And by the 1820s, all enslaved people in New York were to be freed. Hamilton was also a staunch opponent of slavery. However, the Federalists also needed votes from the South, so they chose a Southern slaveholder as their vice presidential candidate, who was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So the Republicans had Jefferson, the slaveholder, the Federalists had Pinckney, the slaveholder, but both parties also had an abolitionist on their ticket. In the midst of this campaign, in late August of 1800, an enslaved worker named Gabriel, sometimes he's called Gabriel Prosser because that was the master or slave owner under whom he worked. An enslaved man named Gabriel organized an insurrection. The plan was for enslaved workers in the Richmond area to gather in the night to raid the homes of the slave owners in that area, seize weapons, march on Richmond, and confront the governor, who was none other than James Monroe, and demand equality and freedom for black people in Virginia. But on August the 30th, the very night this was to happen, there was a huge storm. The plan was delayed for a day. Somebody in the group of the rebels told the story of what was to happen to one of the slave owners, and the plot was discovered. Immediately, many enslaved people were arrested, dozens and dozens rounded up. This is an image here on one side showing enslaved workers working in tobacco fields in Virginia. The image of Gabriel's rebellion is shown here on a slide showing one of the historical markers in Henrico County in Virginia. This group of enslaved workers was all put on trial. 25 of them were immediately convicted and sentenced to death and executed, but there were many more who could have been executed. Meanwhile, Gabriel himself fled toward Newport, where he was arrested, brought back to the Richmond area, put on trial, and he too was executed. But there were others to be executed, and Jefferson was asked by Monroe, what should we do? And Jefferson suggested it would be best to be more lenient. In other words, deport them, don't execute them, the enslaved workers who were under arrest. So some were sent off to Mexico, because he didn't want to alienate voters in Pennsylvania who he needed in the election of 1800. And by the way, the state of Virginia gave $9,000 to the owners of these enslaved workers as compensation for sending them away or for executing them. So this great rebellion created a dilemma for both parties, because the Federalists needed support in South Carolina and North Carolina to try to get electoral votes in those states. The Republicans needed support in Pennsylvania and New York to try to get support. And so this is an image of Gabriel. I don't like to call him Prosser because that's the name of the person who owned Gabriel. But that's how he's often known. So this is an image from a later period. But the irony of 1800 is both parties ultimately decided black lives don't matter. And they decided that because each was trying to navigate this very complicated concern about law and order. At first, the Federalists said, look, the Jacobin Republicans are causing a revolution, because there was suspicion of Jacobin agents in Virginia. But then they kind of backed away because Pinckney did not want that to be part of the Federalist position. This is Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. You can see his image. He was one of the largest slave-holding plantation owners in South Carolina. And this is an image from around 1790 of enslaved women working on a plantation in South Carolina. So what we have here is the role of race becoming one of the pivot points in 1800, and neither party able to take a strong stand against slavery because of the very delicate electoral balance. The other thing I want to point out is these 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which showed the role of systemic racism in the Constitution that had been created. You'll probably remember that as part of the compromise to get the Constitution adopted, it was agreed that Southern states which held slaves could count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the census, which greatly expanded the congressional representation and electoral college vote of the Southern states. They had 3/5 more voters, but those people couldn't vote. So it gave enormous power to the Southern white community, and it became the beginning of what we might now call the Southern strategy. In order to get elected, the Federalists had to figure out a way to get some electoral votes from the South. And they could not really protest when this Virginia slave insurrection was repressed because they couldn't afford to risk votes in North Carolina and South Carolina. So now I want to move to the 8th polarizing factor, the view of the Electoral College. I've mentioned the South's overrepresentation in the Electoral College. So the real election in 1800 wasn't a popular election. The real election was who could get the most electoral votes. And some of the delegations voted by districts. So each congressional district, we still do this a little bit, I think in Nebraska and Maine, but most states now throw all of their votes to whoever wins the popular vote, or at least that's been the tradition. In 1800, there were 16 states, and 11 of those states chose their electors by a vote of the state legislature. Whoever controlled the state legislature would choose the electors. So the real action was who would win the state legislative elections. And then the other 5 states, which included Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Maryland, and Rhode Island, voted by districts. So you could conceivably get some votes from a state. And you'll notice on this map, North Carolina actually split and the Federalist won 4 of the votes. But Virginia worked its way around this problem by passing a law that says we're going to do a winner take all, and every district will vote for an entire slate. And it'll be a statewide election. So even though there were some Federalist districts, the Democrats, I mean the Republicans, won all the districts and therefore won the majority of the whole state and therefore got all 21 electoral votes. But the real action took place up in New York. New York in 1796 had been controlled in the legislature by the Federalists, and all 12 votes in New York went to John Adams. But in 1800, there was a New York legislative election in April, and the key question was who would control the state legislature? Whoever won that election would control the 12 electoral votes of New York. And in that very bitterly contested election, the action took place in New York City. There was a winner-take-all in the system within New York. Whoever won the largest number of votes in the city would receive all 13 legislative representatives in the New York State legislature. It was a winner take all. And the Republicans won the city of New York by 450 votes. And therefore, all 13 votes of New York City went to the state legislature as, all 13 legislators were in the New York State legislature as Republican voters, and all 12 of New York's electoral votes went to Jefferson. That flipped the decisive number of votes. This is an image of a vote a little bit later, a famous painting by George Caleb Bingham from around 1850, but it's very much like elections throughout the early 1800s. Notice that only white men can vote. Notice that people just walk up and they were given a sheet of paper. They would write the name of the elector that they wanted to vote for. Remember, you got to know who the names of your electors are, and the Republicans got a sheet, so you look to that and you write down the names of all the electors. So the state of New York flipped, the state legislature flipped to the Republicans, and because of this, Hamilton tried to get the legislature, a lame duck legislature, to immediately vote for its electors before the new legislature took office. But the governor said to Hamilton, no, we're not going to do it. So New York went to Jefferson. The other example of the attempt to control the Electoral College was a senator from Pennsylvania named James Ross. He was a Federalist from Pennsylvania. He feared that Pennsylvania was going to go entirely to the Republicans. He therefore proposed in the Congress, this is an image of where Congress met until the summer of 1800 in Philadelphia. He proposed that a committee should be established in the Congress to decide on the legitimacy of the electors from each state. In other words, no matter what the electors said, if there were two rival delegations, this committee would decide who was given legitimacy to vote in the Electoral College. And if this had passed, there was going to be a 13-member super committee that would determine who got to represent each state. Another attempt to do an end run around the Electoral College, just like Hamilton in New York, but this was defeated because some voters in the House refused to go along. But I mentioned that as another factor. And finally, in the fall of 1800, a final factor, Hamilton so hated John Adams. You know, Hamilton's become sort of a sainted figure because of the musical, I guess. But he published a 54-page denunciation of Adams saying that Adams was not fit to be president. And because of this, we might call it an October surprise. The Republicans prevailed in South Carolina, even though it was Pinckney's home state. The Federalists were divided, and therefore Jefferson got the most votes. The Electoral College was a very contentious issue. And finally, the last issue I want to mention, because of the way this all ended up, it's going to go to Congress, it's going to be divided. The Federalists realized the Republicans have won the congressional elections. They're going to take control of both the House and the Senate after March. And so in 1800 and in 1801, the Federalists launch a plan to seize control of the judiciary. They know they're going to lose the presidency. They know they're going to lose the Congress. And it's at this point, they're trailing in the House 69 to 36, and in the Senate 18 to 13. So the Federalists decide to control the judiciary. They pass the Judiciary Act of 1801. They create 3 new circuit courts, increasing the number from 3 to 6, and create 16 new judgeships, and appoint Federalist judges to all 16 judge positions. And then the Republicans were enraged about this because they said, look, we won the election and they're seizing control of the judiciary to block us, which was exactly what they were doing. And then in January of 1801, this Justice of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, who was a man named Oliver Ellsworth, resigned. And Adams, after the election had already taken place, he knew he was on his way out, he appointed this man, John Marshall, as Chief Justice, and the Federalist Senate approved him within a week. And on February 4th, 1801, John Marshall became Chief Justice of the United States, a Federalist appointee, and he remained in that position from 1801 to 1835, long after everybody in the election of 1800 was gone. This was truly a judicial seizure of power. And yet, finally, Jefferson prevailed. And he went forward on March the 4th, 1801, with his inauguration. He went to the Capitol to give his speech, although the Federalist leaders had mostly left, including John Adams, left Washington. And Jefferson gave a remarkably conciliatory speech. And here's a quote from his speech. "This election being now decided by the voice of the people, let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve the Union or to challenge its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free. You may not like what we're doing, but we're not going to prosecute you. We're not going to lock you up." And this was an amazing thing because it was a transfer of power. This was virtually unprecedented in modern history, that someone had taken power through an election and the losing candidate, the loser, had surrendered power. And so Jefferson interpreted his victory as the triumph of republicanism. And this is very different than what happened in 1860, because in 1860, the Democrats refused to accept Lincoln's victory and they seceded from the Union before Lincoln was even inaugurated. So finally, all of this raises the question of why did Jefferson prevail? Despite the anger about religious differences, the fear of European ideas, the distrust of foreigners, the struggle to control the judiciary, all of this did not destroy the system. And it remained in place down to 1860 and even beyond, although in 1860 it collapsed. But the election of 1800 showed how systemic racism benefited the South. Because if the 3/5 clause had not been in effect, John Adams would have won the Electoral College vote by 2 votes, and Jefferson would never have been president. And this pattern would continue repeatedly down to 1860, when the Democrats could no longer, the slaveholders, could no longer control the Electoral College. Just to give you an example of what this meant, in the year of 1800, Virginia had 534,000 white citizens. New York had 586,000 white citizens. But because Virginia had 350,000 enslaved people, they had 21 electoral votes and New York only had 12. And Massachusetts only had 16, although they had 422,000 citizens and no slaves. You see, the census played to the advantage of the South. And this is why when people talk about systemic racism and the US Constitution, this is exactly what they're talking about with relation to the Electoral College. So the election of 1800 was a step forward in the history of American democracy, but it was also a glaring example of how systemic racism shaped early American history and continued long after 1800. Adams lost the election because of the Electoral College system, but enslaved people lost even more. People like Gabriel, people like the enslaved rebels in Virginia. And it's the story of Gabriel's insurrection in 1800 that leads us toward the election of 1860 and the next session of this seminar, the next great polarization. So I'm going to stop there, and we will open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer. That's found this disembodied voice is Max Orr, and I hope you can all hear me out there. It was an excellent talk. Very much a lot of things that make us think of the present situation. I'm going to start with we have some questions already coming. I want to encourage everyone to put their questions in the question and answer button at the bottom. Rich Haney had asked a question, and then he said you had sort of answered, but maybe you could summarize it again for everyone. and that is, why did the Federalists hate Jefferson so much? So maybe just summarize in a bullet points.
I think there were two main reasons. Jefferson was identified with the Jacobins and the French Revolution, and he was seen as someone who was hostile to the social elites that were close to the Federalists, and he was seen as anti-religious and a philosophe, and therefore on both political and religious grounds, many people deeply hated Jefferson.
Thank you for that. We have Bill Walker, good friend Bill Walker. We know you spoke a little bit about why the Electoral College was split in terms of the way that the states would allocate their electoral votes. But why was North Carolina split in the Electoral College? Was there a reason why the eastern portion was?
That is because, here, I don't know if you can bring this map up. There were 5 states that voted by districts. 16 made the vote by the state legislature. North Carolina in 1800 was one of the states that still voted by districts. It's a little bit like Nebraska today. There's like the 1st congressional district, the 2nd congressional district. North Carolina in 1800 still did not have a winner-takes-all electoral college vote. They also did not settle the vote in the legislature. Therefore, the Federalists could win a few districts of North Carolina and therefore carry 4 electoral votes into the Electoral College.
Do we have any idea why those particular areas of North Carolina were voting Federalist?
There were Federalists in North Carolina, even slaveholders like Mr. Davie, the founder of the University of North Carolina. He was an advocate of the Federalist cause. He was very close to John Adams. A number of the wealthy merchants and landowners in North Carolina were closely linked to the Federalist Party in this period. And some of the founders of the University of North Carolina also were linked to the Federalist, which did not systematically oppose slavery.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question from good friend Paul Connick. Just how egalitarian were the Democratic Republicans? Their role in establishing such institutions as the Electoral College, not to mention slavery, suggests that they believed in social hierarchy. So just how egalitarian?
How democratic were the Democratic Republicans?
How egalitarian in particular?
Egalitarian? Well, of course, the glaring contradiction for the Democratic Republicans was slavery. They were defenders of the racist slave system, although not all of them, because Aaron Burr in New York had introduced legislation for the gradual emancipation of slaves in New York. But compared to the Federalists, they were much more eager to allow immigrant populations to vote. One of the reason the Federalists lost in the city of New York in 1800 was that the wards that were predominantly immigrant wards went overwhelmingly for the Republican Party. The Federalists, I think, carried 3 or 4 of the wards of New York City, but the votes were fairly close. The wards that were dominated by recently arrived Germans in particular, but other immigrants, went overwhelmingly for the Republicans. And it was because they believed that the Republicans were much more receptive to voting rights and to political rights for, let's say, non-elite people. And in general, the Republicans became the leaders in abolishing property requirements for voting rights of white males, something the Federalists did not support. So, of course, they were not fully democratic, and they were linked, of course, to the slave system. But compared to the Federalists, they are often seen as the big advocates of a more democratic American society. Gordon Wood wrote about this in the radicalization, the radicalism of the American Revolution, that this was the moment when America became more democratic for white males.
Great, thank you for that. Jerry Everhart asks, could you comment on the conflict between those who thought the U.S. should remain an agrarian society and those who thought the U.S. should take a more mercantile path?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, Jefferson, although he had lived in Paris, or maybe because he had lived in Paris, believed that cities were corrupting. I mean, this is the irony. The Democrats, I call them Democratic Republicans, in 1800, essentially won the election because they carried New York City. But ironically, they were the great advocates of rural life. And the farming interests of the rural states like Tennessee and Kentucky and Western Virginia. The Hamiltonians believed that there should be urban commerce, big banks in the cities, the Bank of the United States. So the contest of 1800 is often seen as part of the split between rural and urban areas, but it was not an absolute split because many of the immigrants who supported the Democratic Republicans or the Republicans were based in the cities. But this rural-urban split would remain an important issue in later politics.
Seems familiar today. We have a question from Nils Brubaker. Regarding immigration around 1800, were there any requirements for incoming immigrants to enter the country? Visa, race or ethnicity, proof of good health, proof of means of support, etc.?
As far as I know, people could come into the country. They had to, you arrived and then you had to have some proof of how long you had lived in the country before you could become a citizen. But this is before there were all the kinds of visa restrictions that we have in the modern era. And, there were people coming for many different reasons. That many of them came I think even as late as 1800, they came sometimes with work requirements, or, people were recruited in Europe to come and work in companies or businesses in New York. But as far as I know, there certainly weren't quotas in terms of who could come into the country.
Great.
But of course, at this point, the immigration was coming overwhelmingly from Europe rather than from Asia.
Thank you for that. We have Nils has a little tag-on question for that, and you sort of addressed it when you talked about the particular states, but maybe as a general idea, what was the percentage of enslaved in the South in 1800?
Well, there were about 5.5 million people in the United States in the period, the late 1790s. About 900,000 were enslaved. So in the South, so let's say, just a ballpark figure, something close to 1/5 of the population in the United States was enslaved people. Not quite 1/5. But in the South, in many states, it was 40% or higher. Even in South Carolina, it was very, very close to. In the colonial period, at various times, there was actually a majority of Black enslaved population. So in the southern states, well, let me just take Virginia. In Virginia, there were 534,000 white people and 350,000 enslaved Black people. So you could say that's what, a 5-to-3 ratio? So, that gives you a rough idea. I think there was a much larger Black population in Virginia than in Kentucky or Tennessee. But, that's more than half, again, as many white people as Black, but still a very large Black population.
It's never fair to ask humanists to do math on the spot, but you did a fantastic
I can't give you the
job.
exact numbers, but let's just take the numbers, 350,000 versus 530,000. That shows you it's a significant population. And of course, in some of the eastern areas and down in the Tidewater, that Black percentage would be much higher than in the West.
Great, thank you for that. Paul Connick asked, the conflict you described seems to have played out entirely in the legislatures and the press. Did these conflicts at any time and in any form play out in the streets? No Proud Boys around 1800, for example?
That's a fascinating question. Both sides believed before the election that there were going to be riots in the street, that the other side would not accept whatever the situation turned out to be. And there were not riots in the streets. I mean, that's an interesting issue. There were conflicts in the Congress. In fact, in the late 1790s, there was a famous fist fight between a Federalist and a Democratic Republican right in the House of Representatives. But in the streets in February of 1801, it did not play out in a riot. Now, this may be because of communications. People in Boston, for example, didn't know day by day what was happening in Washington, D.C. in the Congress. And by the time they heard, it was all decided. It took still over a week for news to get from Virginia to Massachusetts. Today, maybe because we have instant news coverage, it would be a much more contentious situation.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Rich Haney. Are you able to guess the different things Adams would have done as president if he had won?
So let me say, I want to give a shout out to Adams. You know, David McCullough wrote a book that was very sympathetic to John Adams. And Alexander Hamilton has gotten so much positive press. But Hamilton really did want to have war with France, as best I can tell. He saw France as a threat to the Republic. Adams made every effort to make a peace negotiation, which he did. He succeeded in making peace with France. Therefore, there would not have been a war with France if, despite what the Republicans were saying, if Adams had gotten in. On the other hand, I don't think he would have been against slavery because his own vice presidential candidate and his own allies in South Carolina were slaveholders. I think there would have been a continuing attempt to restrict the franchise. We don't know. Would the Alien and Sedition Acts have been renewed? They expired in 1801. Of course, Jefferson's party didn't renew them. Would that have been renewed? We don't know. You know, this is like a counterfactual question. What would have happened if John Adams won in 1800? And what would the Republicans have done? Would they have gone into the streets? Would they have made riots? We don't know.
Thank you for that. We have an anonymous question here. Why does Burr have such a negative impression? He was almost president.
Burr was seen as somebody who had no real values, although ironically, as I said, he did promote the abolition of slavery in New York. But he was seen by everybody as a kind of ambitious, cynical person who would do anything to get into office. You know how nowadays we say, oh, he'll do anything to get elected? That's how Burr was viewed. That's how Hamilton viewed Burr. Hamilton absolutely hated what Burr did in that election in the spring of 1800 in New York. He thought he had, you know, manipulated the outcome. He had blocked Hamilton from controlling the state legislature in New York. Ironically, Burr was also a grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the great evangelist. So Timothy Dwight and Aaron Burr were first cousins. Can you believe this? It's just ironic. Burr, his father was the president of Princeton University and his mother was the daughter of Jonathan Edwards. Many people thought Burr was also part of the elite, but Burr became very disillusioned by what happened. He wanted to be president. He would never say in February of 1800, I won't take this job. You know, if he had said, I would refuse to take the position, maybe some Federalists would have broken with Burr. But Burr lost the respect and the trust of Jefferson and of the Republicans because he was conniving probably to get that one vote that he needed. And Hamilton hated Burr about as much as he hated John Adams. And then Jefferson, of course, turned against Burr. Well, especially after Burr killed Hamilton, although Jefferson hated Hamilton too. But then Burr went out to the West and got involved in plots that seemed to be treasonous plots against the United States. And of course, now Burr is seen as the great enemy of Hamilton, and Hamilton has much better press than Jefferson or Burr.
Thank you for that. I have some questions that I'm pushing towards the end because they'd be great closing questions. So I'm going to go down the list here a little bit for Ellen Bradley. Hello, Ellen. I am fascinated to hear about the prevalence of conspiracy theories in 1800. I began voting in 1988 and don't recall their prevalence in recent elections until 2016. Did conspiracy theories become less prevalent in the late 19th and 20th centuries before resurging in 2016?
Well, there have always been some conspiracy theories. You know, during the period of the during the period of the Great Depression, there were often anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and certain political leaders who suspected, that Jewish financiers were behind the policies, or there was a conspiracy of big industrialists to bring on World War I. There were certainly communist conspiracy theories during the McCarthy period in the 1950s. The difference was that these conspiracy theories were usually quite marginalized in many periods. They were not so marginalized in 1800. This theory that the Bavarian Illuminati was conspiring to take over was very widespread. And of course, they've become very widespread now, that there's a secret conspiracy, fake news, a conspiracy to deny people the right to vote, conspiracies to manipulate mail-in voting. So we are in a sense returning to a history of conspiracy, but there have always been conspiracy theories. They're just at one time or another more marginal or more central to the political culture.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question here from Kate Brecky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How did the country come back together, and what can we learn from that today?
So that's a really interesting question, because at first the Federalists, of course, were enraged. They kind of retreated to their New England towns. But Jefferson actually gained wide support, and even some of the Federalists gradually drifted toward the Democratic Republican Party. Even John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, became a member of that party and became Secretary of State under James Monroe, who was the leader of the party after, Madison and Jefferson. The Federalist Party gradually died out. A consensus emerged that there needed to be more political participation, always excluding, of course, African Americans, Native Americans, and of course women. But there needed to be more white male participation. And the Federalists basically lost that debate. And the country, there was a period that is even called the era of good feelings, in the period around 1820, although that's total myth, because the slavery issue was still totally contentious in the Missouri Compromise of 1819. But the polarization really exploded again in 1824 when John Quincy Adams won in the House of Representatives the next time this happened, and Andrew Jackson won the most electoral votes, but not a majority. And Adams, because of Henry Clay's support, won in the House of Representatives. So it all fell apart again, and it never really recovered through to the time of the Civil War. It did come back together in a certain sense, perhaps because it turned out that Jefferson didn't destroy religion, the churches weren't closed down. Some of the things that were predicted to happen just didn't happen.
Thank you for that. And we are out of questions, but we have one statement from Maria Calney, and I think we can all agree with it. She writes, "It seems not much has changed since 1800, scary then as it is now. Perhaps it is hopeful that we will survive the election of 2020. And I think we all hope we survive the election of 2020. So those are our questions. And Lloyd, we leave it to you to wrap up tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for these questions. And I hope we'll come back to these issues on Thursday when we'll be having a panel discussion. But I invite you to tune in tomorrow at 5:30 when Freddie Kiger will be talking about the election of 1860. And then on Wednesday when Suzanne Globetti will be talking about the election of 1968. And then we'll come back to all of these issues on Thursday, including the question of parallels and differences between past polarizations and 2020. Thank you all for joining us, and we will continue this discussion.